In the Western imagination, the narrative of the Second World War is anchored firmly in Europe. We're intimately familiar with the architecture of Nazi hate. We study the Nuremberg laws, the speeches of the Third Reich, and the industrialized horror of the Holocaust. We implicitly understand that the war in Europe wasn't merely a land grab, it was an ideological crusade driven by a warped biological imperative: the Aryan versus the subhuman. We accept that to defeat the enemy in Europe, we had to defeat what they believed. But when our gaze shifts to the Pacific, that clarity often dissolves. In popular history, the war against Japan is frequently stripped of its ideological weight. It's remembered as a savage, chaotic grudge match triggered by Pearl Harbor. We tend to view the Japanese Empire simply as a military machine, aggressive and expansionist certainly, but devoid of the kind of complex, codified racial philosophy we ascribe to Nazi Germany. This perspective is a dangerous oversimplification. The Pacific War was the collision of two incompatible worlds. Imperial Japan was driven by a racial worldview just as systematic, just as ambitious, and just as committed to paper as the one produced in Berlin. To understand the specific brutality of the Pacific War, we have to look at what the Japanese leadership was actually trying to accomplish. They weren't just trying to redraw the map, they were trying to dismantle the Western-dominated world order and replace it with a new metaphysical reality. They viewed the globe not as a collection of sovereign states, but as a disordered house that required a strict new master. They called this mission Hako Ichiu, bringing the 8 corners of the world under one roof. In the eyes of the imperial planners, the global structure was broken because the wrong people were in charge. For centuries, Western powers believed they sat at the pinnacle of civilization. Japan intended to invert that structure, and in this new worldview, the Americans, the British, and the Dutch weren't the masters of the modern world. They were viewed as spiritually hollow and materialistic, an Anglo-Saxon poison that had to be purged from Asia to make way for a superior order. At the center of this ideology was a rigid racial pyramid. At the absolute apex stood the Yamato people, the Japanese, who viewed themselves as a distinct lineage descended from the gods. Below them were other Asian nations, regarded as younger brothers, who required stern Japanese guidance. And at the very bottom were the Westerners, marked for subjugation. In this video, we uncover the forgotten blueprint of this new world order, and we'll open the classified government files that explicitly declared the Yamato race the nucleus of the globe, trace the evolution of the propaganda that turned Westerners into beasts, and reveal how this belief system turned the Pacific into a theater of total, merciless war. This is the story of the Sun Goddess's mandate and the empire that burned to fulfill it. To grasp the terrifying insanity of this racial worldview, we can't simply look at the geopolitics of the 1930s. We have to peel back the layers of the Japanese state to reveal its spiritual foundation. The core of Imperial Japan's identity rested on a concept known as kokutai. While historians often translate this as national polity or national essence, the term carries a far heavier, almost mythical weight. Kokutai defined Japan as a spiritual entity created by the gods themselves. The central tenet of this belief was that the emperor wasn't merely a monarch in the European sense, he was Arehigotami, a living god in human form. The state religion taught that he was the direct, unbroken descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and this was the absolute truth upon which the entire government was built. This divine lineage had profound, terrifying implications for the average Japanese citizen. The ideology taught that the Yamato race was bound to the emperor. The entire nation was conceptualized as a single corpus, or body, a kazoku koka, family state, where every Japanese subject was a literal spirit child of the creator of the universe. This belief created an insurmountable psychological wall between the Japanese people and the rest of humanity. It posited a binary world where there were the Japanese, who possessed a divine spark, and there were the others, who were merely human. Scholars have noted that this assumption of racial homogeneity and divine distinctiveness was the primary fuel for Japan's empire building. It provided a moral blanket that justified any action, no matter how brutal. In the Western empires, colonization was justified by the concept of civilization, the idea of bringing law and technology to the savages. In the Japanese Empire, expansion was justified by unification, bringing the chaotic world under the one roof of the Divine Empire. If your race is holy, then conquest isn't a crime. It's a blessing you bestow upon the conquered. In the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, Japan had desperately tried to go the other way. Terrified of suffering the same fate as China, which had been carved up, drugged with opium, and humiliated by Western powers, Japan threw open its doors and modernized at breakneck speeds. They bought Western guns and they adopted the Western mind. They imported British naval tactics, German military organization, French legal codes, and American engineering. Crucially, they also imported Western science, including the fashionable theories of social Darwinism and racial hierarchy. For decades, Japan tried to prove to the West that they were the honorary whites, a civilized nation worthy of sitting at the high table of global power. They cut their top knots, put on Western suits, listened to classical music, and built industrial factories. They played the game by Western rules, believing that if they became strong enough, the West would finally treat them as equals. The turning point, the moment the mask slipped and the new hierarchy was born, came in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference following World War I. Japan arrived in Paris as a victor, having sided with the Allies. They took their seat among the great powers and proposed a simple amendment to the League of Nations Charter, the Racial Equality Proposal. They weren't asking for an end to colonialism. They were asking for a simple statement, that nations would not be discriminated against on the basis of race. They wanted it in writing that a Japanese man was the legal equal of a British or American man. But the Western powers, particularly the British Empire, which feared for its white-only policies in Australia, and the United States, deep in the era of Jim Crow segregation, crushed the proposal. Despite a majority vote in favour, President Woodrow Wilson unilaterally ruled that it had failed because it was not unanimous. This betrayal sent a shockwave through the Japanese psyche that would last for 20 years. Historians argue that this was the definitive moment Japan decided that the West would never accept them. The realization was that no matter how many battles they won, no matter how many symphonies they composed, to the West, they would always be seen as inferior. The West had built a club that Japan could never join. And so, the Japanese leadership came to a dark conclusion. If they couldn't join the Western hierarchy, they would have to destroy it and build their own. If the world wouldn't let them sit at the table, they would overturn the table entirely. By the time Japan slid into military dictatorship in the 1930s, the resentment had crystallized into a virulent, weaponized anti-Western ideology. This brings us to the bottom tier of the Japanese racial graph, the white Westerner. The Japanese state launched a massive propaganda and educational campaign to redefine the white man. For decades, the West had been the model of modernity. Now, Japanese intellectuals and propagandists recast the West as the source of spiritual infection. This movement was often termed overcoming modernity. The argument was that Western civilization was fundamentally flawed because it was built on individualism, materialism, and selfishness. It was a culture of greed where the individual ego was placed above the community. In contrast, the Japanese spirit, or Seishin, was presented as pure, selfless, and harmonious. Propaganda outlets began to systematically dehumanize the enemy. The Americans and British were referred to as Kichiku Bayai, Anglo-Saxon Beasts. Posters depicted Roosevelt and Churchill as literal demons, ogres with fangs, or monstrous tyrants stepping on the innocent peoples of Asia. The American male was portrayed as a brutish monster and an effeminate degenerate. Japanese wartime media characterized American soldiers as weak-willed, obsessed with jazz, sex, and luxury, and lacking the iron spiritual core of the Japanese warrior. This racialization despiritualized the enemy. By convincing the average Japanese conscript that the American Marine across the jungle clearing was a beast incapable of higher human feeling, the state preemptively erased any impulse for mercy. This view of the West as subhuman or spiritually void directly dictated the treatment of prisoners of war. In the Western tradition of warfare, surrendering was a misfortune, but it didn't strip you of your status as a human being. In the Japanese code of Bushido, as interpreted by the military government, surrender was a moral collapse. To surrender was to sever your link to the Divine Emperor. It was to cease existing as a person of honor. Because the Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to believe they were part of a superior race, they would choose death over dishonor, and they viewed the Allied soldiers who surrendered with absolute contempt. If these white men were truly superior, the Japanese soldier asked, why were they begging for their lives? Why were they not committing suicide to save their honor? This racial contempt is the key to understanding the atrocities of the Bataan Death March and the horrors of the Burma Railway. As noted in historical analyses, the construction of the White Devil allowed Japan to fight a holy war against a morally inferior foe, reversing the typical colonial dynamic where the white man was the civilizer. In this war, Japan was the civilized force, exterminating the savage, materialistic West. If the Japanese stood at the divine apex and the Westerners lay at the subhuman bottom, where did the vast, diverse populations of the rest of Asia fall? This is the middle tier of the racial graph, and it represents the most complex, cynical, and ultimately tragic aspects of the imperial ideology. To drive the Western powers out of Asia, Japan faced a logistical impossibility. They couldn't conquer a continent of nearly 1 billion people solely by force. They needed the cooperation of the masses in China, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, and India. To achieve this, Japan fashioned itself not as a conqueror, but as the great liberator. They unfurled the banner of Pan-Asianism. The slogan, Asia for Asians, was broadcast from radio towers in Tokyo to the furthest jungles of Malaya. They promised a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a utopian bloc of independent Asian nations, free from white colonialism, trading with each other and prospering together. For many in the colonized world, this was an incredibly seductive message. After centuries of humiliation by the British, Dutch, and French, the sight of an Asian army defeating white masters was intoxicating. But the reality behind the slogan was a lie. The co-prosperity sphere wasn't a partnership of equals, it was a strict, patriarchal hierarchy modeled on the traditional Confucian family. In this worldview, Japan was the father or older brother. The other Asian nations were the children or younger brothers. This metaphor is crucial to understanding the abuse that followed. In the traditional feudal family structure, the older brother has a duty to protect the younger siblings, but the younger siblings owe the older brother absolute, unquestioning obedience. Japan acknowledged that the other Asians were racially akin to them. They were of the same stock, unlike the alien Westerners, but they viewed them as incomplete. They believed that China and the rest of Asia had lost their way, becoming weak, disorganized, and corrupted by Western influence. Therefore, it was Japan's divine destiny to guide them. And if the younger brother refused to be guided, it was the older brother's moral duty to beat him into submission. The hierarchy within this middle tier was meticulously graded. Not all Asians were viewed equally. The Chinese people occupied a particularly tragic space in this worldview. Historically, Japan had revered China as the Middle Kingdom, the cradle of civilization and the source of their writing system and Buddhism. But by the 20th century, the Japanese view had curdled into a mix of complex inferiority and deep contempt. They viewed modern China as dirty, chaotic, and politically fractured. A fallen giant that had allowed itself to be drugged by opium and carved up by the West. This contempt fueled the horrific violence seen in the rape of Nanjing. To the Japanese ultranationalist, the massacre was a punitive expedition. It was the violent disciplining of a recalcitrant, ungrateful younger brother who refused to acknowledge the new head of the family. In the long-held colonies like Korea and Taiwan, the hierarchy was enforced through a policy of kominka, or imperialization. Here, the goal was erasure. The Japanese attempted to extinguish Korean culture entirely. They banned the teaching of the Korean language, burned Korean history books, and forced millions to adopt Japanese names. They compelled Koreans to worship at Shinto shrines, praying to the ancestors of their conquerors. They were trying to upgrade these people into imperial subjects, second-class citizens destined to serve as foot soldiers and laborers for the master race. Further south, in the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Burma, the view was even more dismissive. These populations were viewed merely as resource nodes. The internal government documents referred to them as supply zones. The Japanese military machine required oil, rubber, and rice, and they requisitioned it with little regard for the local population's survival. In Vietnam alone, Japanese rice requisitioning contributed to a famine that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people. In Indonesia, millions died from forced labor and starvation. Perhaps the darkest expression of this hierarchy was the Romusha and the comfort women's systems. The Japanese military conscripted millions of Asians into forced labor gangs or Romusha to build airfields and railways, treating them as disposable biological machinery. Simultaneously, they institutionalized sexual slavery, where women from Korea, China, and the Philippines were trafficked to serve Japanese troops. Even here, a racial hierarchy existed, with different values assigned to women of different ethnicities. By 1945, the co-prosperity sphere had collapsed into a nightmare. The liberators had become far more brutal than the colonial masters they'd replaced. The gap between the high-minded rhetoric of racial brotherhood and the reality of mechanized plunder was too vast to ignore. Japan had proved that in their new world order, Asia for Asians simply meant Asia for Japan. The Japanese government committed their racial worldview to paper in highly classified planning documents that were never meant to be seen by the public. One of the most chilling of these is a massive secret report completed in 1943 by the Ministry of Health and Welfare. It was titled An Investigation of Global Policy with the Yamato Race as a Nucleus. This 3,000-page document is the smoking gun of Japanese racial planning. It was the blueprint for a post-war world. The document explicitly lays out a vision of the Earth restructured entirely around the Yamato race. It utilizes a bizarre mixture of German geopolitical theory, Plato's Republic, and Japanese mythology, arguing that the Western colonial model failed because it was based on exploitation. Japan's model, they claimed, would be based on organic harmony, but their definition of harmony was totalitarian. They argued that just as a solar system needs a sun, the world needs a leading race to maintain order. Without a clear hierarchy, there is chaos. Therefore, Japan's dominance was necessary for global peace. The planners behind this document envisioned a long-term future that sounds like science fiction today. They mapped out plans for the massive dispersal of the Japanese population. They intended to plant settlements of Japanese families across Asia, the Pacific, and even into New Zealand and Australia. These settlers were to act as the nucleus, the racial elite that would oversee the administration of the inferior populations. They even calculated the necessary birth rates to ensure the Yamato race could biologically dominate the region within a few generations. This hierarchy effectively blinded the Japanese nation to reality. An ideology that declares your enemy to be a soulless beast and yourself to be a god is a powerful drug, but it's a dangerous one. It leads to a fatal underestimation of the adversary. Because the ideology insisted that the Japanese spirit was superior to American materialism, the Japanese leadership convinced themselves that the United States was brittle. They believed that Americans, being selfish individualists, wouldn't have the stomach for a long, bloody war. They believed that once the Japanese struck hard, the soft Westerners would crumble. They fundamentally misunderstood the resolve of their enemy because their racial lens distorted the image. Furthermore, this belief in divine invincibility made it impossible to stop the war once it was clearly lost. By 1944, Japanese cities were burning, their navy was at the bottom of the sea, and their supply lines were cut. A rational government would have sued for peace. But the Japanese hierarchy wasn't rational. It was theological. To surrender was to admit that the hierarchy was false. It was to admit that the beasts had defeated the gods. This cognitive dissonance paralyzed the leadership. They retreated deeper into fantasy, crafting slogans like "the 100 million will die as shattered jewels," preparing to sacrifice the entire population of Japan rather than accept that their racial worldview was a lie. When the dust settled in August 1945, the hierarchy collapsed. The divine land had been conquered, not by gods, but by the mongrel armies of the United States. For a brief, terrifying decade, this racial pyramid, Japan at the apex, Asia in the middle, and the West at the bottom, dictated the lives and deaths of millions of people. It serves as a grim, necessary reminder that the Pacific War wasn't just a battle over maps or resources, it was a collision of two distinct, racially charged worldviews. It was a war where Japan looked in the mirror and saw a god, looked at its neighbor and saw a servant, and looked at the West and saw a monster. And in the pursuit of that illusion, they set the world on fire. But what do you think? Why is it that the Western historical memory is so fixated on the racial crimes of Nazi Germany, while the equally rigid and destructive racial hierarchy of Imperial Japan is often overlooked? Do you think the brutality of the Pacific War was inevitable given these beliefs, or was it merely the result of the desperation of total war? And looking at the geopolitical tensions that still exist today between Japan, China, and the Koreas, how much of that modern friction is a ghost of this forgotten worldview? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.